second day of the extension of the Virtual Knowledge Summit. Before I start with my conversation with Professor Riel Miller, that I'm honored to have with me today, please allow me to start with some housekeeping. So first of all, if you are joining us from the platform, from the actual platform of the Knowledge Summit, and you would like to hear the Arabic interpretation, I would like to invite you to just hover your mouse and click on the headphones that you can see and choose Arabic. However, if you are joining us from social media, Twitter or Facebook, if you'd like to listen the interpretation, the Arabic interpretation, there is a link that is in the post, either in the post itself or in the first comment under the post, where you could click on a link where you would just register your email, and then you'll be able to hear the interpretation. But also this way you'll be getting your certificate of attendance. Hello, Professor Miller. So our session today is all about futures literacy. What is futures literacy? Why is it important? We will see with Professor Miller. Professor Miller, who is one of the world's leading authorities on the theory and practice of using the future to change what people see and do. Professor Miller has served as head of foresight and futures literacy at UNESCO, and he currently is a fellow at the J. Herbert Smith Center for Technology Management and Entrepreneurship at the University of New Brunswick in Canada, and a fellow at École des Ponts Business School in France, but he is also a professor at the University of Stavanger in Norway. Professor Miller, let us start. First of all, can you please tell us what is futures literacy? How can you define it and unpack it to us?
Absolutely, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you, and I'm very glad to be able to participate in the wonderful work that's being done around the Knowledge Forum and the Summit. This attempt that we have, which is the ongoing, I think, wonder and excitement of being human, is to explore and to understand. And I would say futures literacy is exactly that. Futures literacy is really a way of trying to underscore or point out that the future is something that plays an immense role in everything we see and do. And I'm grateful you put that in my introduction. And there is an important distinction here, what we see and what we do. You have to look at a menu before you make a choice. And the things that we see, the items on the menu around us, are deeply influenced by our images of the future. And the reason that futures literacy uses the word literacy is because it really does pick up on this question of competency, of a skill. These days, and it's primarily in English, but it's also now in other languages, is the idea of literacy is the idea of a capability, a competency. Financial literacy, internet literacy, etc. And the idea of futures literacy is to understand that when humans use the future, and again, that's a little bit of a strange phrase, use the future, because we don't often say use the future, but when we deploy what we have imagined, we are using what we have imagined. And this might seem obvious, but it really sets us on a voyage of understanding our imagination and understanding the role that our imagination plays in hope and in fear. If you imagine that there's a danger on the other side of the door, this is a very important thing. If you imagine that there's a wonderful cake on the other side of the door, this is a very important thing. It focuses your attention. It changes your heart rate. And so understanding the way in which our imagination is created, what are the sources of our imagination, and how what we imagine influences what we see, what we pay attention to. When you cross the street, you're imagining that you're on the other side. You're not there yet. And you imagine you're going to be on the other side. And what do? you look to see if there are cars or other dangers, and you assess the likelihood, probabilistic, of getting across. You use an imaginary scenario. If you're going to cook dinner, you haven't eaten your dinner yet. You're going to cook dinner. You are going to cook dinner. It's in the future. You will choose the ingredients for what you will cook. This is very practical, very directive. And so futures literacy is really about understanding, and this is somewhat surprising perhaps to the kind of technocratic traditions and the refined or elite knowledge that has so often dominated. But the future is made up of all kinds of things. Your mood, how you woke up in the morning, are you pessimistic or optimistic? It's influenced by superstitions. It's influenced by the way in which you tell stories to yourself. Do you tell the story of the heroic moment? Do you tell the story of the wise turtle? What story do you tell that helps you to shape the story that you must invent to imagine the future? And so understanding and unpacking all of the elements of our imagination, including, of course, the rigorous models of forecasting. Look at the impact and the importance of the IPCC forecasts for climate change. These are images of the future. That future is not here yet, but we use the model and the forecast to deeply influence what we think about, what we see, and what we do. The same goes for strategic foresight, where we generate scenarios and we help people realize that there are multiple futures, many futures. But there's also the other side, which is that the future can be a constraint, meaning the future can blind us to the present. And here I think there's something very important in your report on knowledge, which has to do with transformation. I like to think about transformation, and here we'll get to the fragility and vulnerability issues. I like to think about transformation as something that's unknowable. You can't know what the transformation is going to be until it happens. But you can try and understand the way things are moving away from the past. In other words, if you break away, if you critique, if you distance yourself, let's say, from racism, and you say, I want to be anti-racist or anti-colonial, then you say, I'm being against something, I'm moving away. That's a transitional position to take. And these kinds of transitional perspectives can help us to realize the extent to which the reproduction of the past is a problem. That the reproduction of the past locks us in. Why am I paying attention to the need for many blacksmiths? We need a lot of blacksmiths because we have a lot of horses. Of course. Then you think, right, this is the time when there were lots of horses. And in New York, there was also a big problem with horse manure. There were all sorts of problems with horses in big cities like London and New York, et cetera, back in the 19th century. And we pay attention and we think that, but if you're paying attention to other things, you see entirely other possibilities. And those possibilities may be durable, meaning they may have continuity, but they may also be related to something ephemeral. And this is, again, one of the really crucial things. If we think about our future in terms of permanency, continuity, durability, then we build castles. We build defensive situations. We create brittleness. We create fragility because we're continuously defending to reproduce the past, to keep things the same. But our universe is so rich in change. It's so rich in difference. And our ability to appreciate difference, which is meaning, and here I don't mean using it tomorrow, I mean just feeling it now, understanding difference now, appreciating difference now, being inspired by difference from the point of view of creativity, and then trying to cultivate, to water, to harvest into the future, continuity, are all aspects of creating more agile, more adaptable relationships between humans and what I would call the complex nature of our world. Our world is complex. It's not more or less, it just is. And complexity means that the only certainty is uncertainty. That change and difference are not something we can get rid of. So if we want to be able to sleep well at night, what's the better position to take? Well, I've figured it all out and I've eliminated all change and my plan will go perfectly and I will create the world as I see it tomorrow. I don't think you'll sleep very well if you think that that's your position, because you know that you won't succeed, because you know that change and difference will occur. So isn't it much better to say, I will welcome that change, I will welcome that difference. I will not only be oriented by my strategic thinking, which is related to planning. It's not just about the strategy I designed yesterday. It's also about the strategy that was I couldn't even imagine because there had been no COVID pandemic. And boom, in 2 days, all things change. It's not 20 years, 30 years, it's complexity, tipping points. And our ability to appreciate that, not in the sense, of course, there's disruption, there can be harm, there are costs, but there are also immense openings in the potential of the world around us. So futures literacy is really an entry point into understanding the power of the human imagination, of diversifying the way we use that imagination. And just like reading and writing literacy, right? When you learn to read and write, we don't know what you're going to write. We don't know what you're going to read. You're going to read all kinds of things. You're going to write all kinds of things. It's a capability. And I can't say if you'll do good things with your reading and writing or bad things. And you might even learn some things that are harmful, but by that harm, just like the immune system, you might get wiser. You might learn more, because you can't just learn from good things. You need to also learn from failures and experiments. So capability-based approaches to development, and you talked about development, are more robust from that point of view. They're more open. They're more able to take into account the way the world actually works, which is continuously generating difference and allowing us to see things in new ways. And seeing precedes choosing. The future is crucial to that ability. Learning to be futures literate, and I'll end with this point, learning to be futures literate is actually quite easy once you start to pay attention, in the following sense. Even a baby uses anticipation. They cry to get fed. A child crossing the street looks to see if there are cars. We use the future anticipatory systems. We imagine the future all the time. It's related to our hopes, our fears, our expectations. When we become more aware that there are different kinds of future, in the same way that we become aware that there are different kinds of fiction and reading and writing, when you become more aware, you can use it better. You become more able. And futures literacy arises naturally from the many different kinds of anticipatory systems and processes that humans use, of which there are many: forecasting, strategic foresight, divination, fantasies, daydreaming, etc. All of these ways of constructing our images of the future are things that we can understand better. And as we understand them better, we understand the world around us better.
Great, awesome. I think that people need to understand that change is the only constant, and this is primordial in futures literacy. We are starting to get questions from the audience. I will take one for now. How can we develop a futures or a forward-thinking mindset? How can we teach people futures literacy? How can that be done practically?
Let me draw your attention, Stephanie, to two aspects of that question, okay? The first aspect is the part which is, in some senses, almost invisible to us, meaning we assume that the future is about the future. So when we say forward, looking or futures oriented, we are really talking about, which mountain should I climb? Which climate target should I select? Which SDG do I want to achieve? And we're thinking about goals. And to kind of draw people's attention to some of the downsides or negative aspects of living with goals all the time, is to say that this is actually a way of thinking about the future that usually suffers from a double colonization. On the one hand, the goal is not necessarily something you came up with, meaning the goal that you have in mind, the top of Mount Everest or whatever, is somebody else's goal. Build the city like New York, make Shanghai look like London, whatever, or make London look like Shanghai. Imitation, Silicon Valley, etc. And this is an image from somebody else. And it's very natural, by the way, because of course, all of us have grown up. And when we grow up, we look to our older siblings, our parents, a hero who's older, a heroine who's older, and we think, aha, I'm going to become like them, imitation. And in that sense, we think to ourselves, well, I will, through will, and force of character, be able to impose my view of the future, being just like this other person, and I will make it happen. Well, I call that, colonizing the future, and it's this double colonization. On the one hand, I'm colonized by somebody else's image, and on the other hand, I'm trying to impose my will on the future. And this is what I like to call using the future for the future, and it's very important, and it's very powerful, and we need to use that all the time, because we're planning dinner, or we're planning a supply chain, or we're planning to build a building or a refinery or whatever it is. We do a lot of investment, we do a lot of accumulation, we create a lot of path dependency, and we try to colonize in different ways. We try to be aware of where the images of the future are coming from. And those are all aspects of being more forward-looking. And of course, it's something that's important to do. We were talking about economics before. Economics is a field that's very much about calculating and assessing what's going to happen in the future using various categories and techniques. But there's a whole other aspect to the future that gets kind of erased or obscured by that. And I was referring to it before, and it's what you might call anticipation for emergence. And by emergence, it means something I cannot know in advance. So it means a certain humility, meaning you have to say right from the beginning, look, lots of things are going to happen, and I am not even going to have a name for them. COVID, what? COVID, what? What's the name? TikTok, what? I'm not even going to have a name for it. But guess what? That's going to happen. So either I'm going to be saying to myself, no. It needs to stick to the dictionary that I have in my pocket. That one's already written. It's official. It's formal. That dictionary will now dominate everything always. No, doesn't work that way. So from the point of view of being forward-looking, part of that forward-looking approach is to say it's not about knowing the future. It's not about goals. It's not about dominating the future. It's actually about allowing the future to emerge, to be novel, and for surprise to be a resource we can use. And that for me is why the term futures literacy makes more sense, because it's not just for the future, it's also for emergence and for novelty and for difference. Now, when it comes to learning about this, actually, I think it's a curious thing, but most people, as they experience life, and I'll take the example of love. Most people, when you're young and you have this idea about love, and let's say you have this very idealized, romantic, let's call it simplistic conception of love, you think, aha, this will happen to me, and then everything will be perfect, like the prince and princess forever and ever. What's in the nursery rhymes. Maybe you've seen Shrek and you think, ooh, wow, okay, I'm gonna be able to have this wonderful life once I fall in love with the princess. But of course, as we experience life, we realize that we change and our partners change, and that in fact it's something that evolves and it doesn't stay static. And this realization that the world we live in is emergent and complex, and we cannot know in advance, and that we must learn, even if we don't have the words for what's going on, we must invent those words. This is a crucial experience. And look, at the moment, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine are both very powerful lessons in the importance of being able to reinvent, to let go of expectations, to not depend on the past. And so what I'm saying here is that from the point of view of learning, it's really a question of creating the structures and the practice, the experience that allows people to recognize that we are using anticipation for the future all the time. We're planning dinner, we're planning a trip, we're going to school, but we're also using anticipation for emergence, meaning we're making sense of things we did not even know existed, and we're doing that all the time. But instead of saying to ourselves, which is often the way the values are put, keep your feet on the ground, do what you know already, play it safe, make a sure bet. Don't be too fanciful. Don't be unrealistic. Be realistic. What does be realistic mean? Be realistic means do what you already know. Work, use your imagination on the basis of the past. But that's a recipe to be confused and frightened when the world unfolds. So really here we're talking about something that has to do with just, and this is not unusual for humans, finding pedagogic and theoretical, meaning structures and categories, words that allow us to disentangle, to make sense, to capture, and to give it meaning, to make sense of what is going on, and to be able to distinguish between images of the future that are goal-oriented and for the future, and images of the future that I wouldn't have even been able to imagine the day before yesterday. But I can use my imagination to do that and change the way I see the present, change the menus, and understand, of course, that if you are capable in this way, if you are futures literate, and you are making these distinctions between probable futures, desirable futures, emergent futures, you are going to be more comfortable, more at ease, more agile. I call it walking on two legs. You're much more stable, but also much more able if you're walking on two legs. It doesn't mean you can't hop on one leg, the one leg of planning, the one leg of colonizing the future. And we're actually very good at that. That leg has become very, 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 very strong. But if we take the other leg and we start to say, let's exercise that other leg and let's strengthen that other leg, and then ask the question, what's the relationship between the two legs, between planning and improvisation, between determinism and openness? If we can begin to understand better the relationship between the two, then in fact, I think we'll be more comfortable in the world around us, but also more able to do what in the knowledge report you talk about, which is actually kind of surf reality, surf the emergent, novel, complex world, and take advantage of that in such a way that we do things that we wouldn't have expected and that we couldn't know in advance, but give meaning and also create a sense of confidence. It's like when you fall down, you have to get back up, get back on the horse. You have to be able to overcome that. And this is a way, futures literacy and being able to understand better what we're doing with our imagination, to become confident in that way. And I think children can learn about it, but primarily, and I'll end here, adolescence, when you move into the adolescent phase, you're not testing anticipatory systems that are survival oriented as much. They're not as don't touch the stove, do things like that. They're more related to, do my friends like me? How do I establish a good relationship? And you move from determinism to ambiguity, emergence, novelty. But just at the time when there's a sense of insecurity and there's this shift towards, let's call it, more mature anticipatory systems, we often impose, parents try to, but also society, to say, no, look, you need to realize that you should listen to the teacher, follow the rules, you'll do step by step, and if you do this, A, you'll get to B, if you get to B, you'll get to C, and the future will be secure. So just at the moment in adolescence when it's time to start testing and cultivating and working with ambiguity and openness and emergence and novelty, we tend to shut down that experimentation. And I think that's quite a terrible problem, really, is that we need to help everybody, including adults who have all gone through school and been adolescents in a rather determinist world, to develop futures literacy, to develop their capacity to walk on two legs. And I think it's doable, but it's a big ask, because for the time being, we're still very, very, very attached to the idea that if only I was smart enough, if only if I had a good enough model, if only I could do this, that, if only the leader really knew what they were doing, then everything would be fine and I could know the future, I could conquer the future. And conquest is related to the future. And we see what's going on with conquest today. I'll conquer the future, I'll be successful, and what I have already in my head, which is based on the past, will be forever. And so this position, which is very powerful today, makes it difficult to cultivate futures literacy, because we end up just cultivating one leg, not the other, and we remain imbalanced.
Okay, so you think that we cannot impose our will on the future? The future is too uncertain, too ambiguous. However, we need to be prepared for it. We need to equip ourselves with the right tools. We need to be future literate and understand.
Hang on. We can't know what the right tools are. We can't know what the right tools are. You see, even the way you formulate that, we can be prepared, okay, in the sense that you can learn to read, but you're not going to know what you're going to do with the reading and writing. So you don't know if you have the right, you might say, oh, well, I need to learn about equations now. I didn't know that I needed to learn about equations because now I want to understand equations. And here we get to the knowledge, the push and the pull side of things. Here we get to learning, really, is that the way to be prepared is to be a good learner, to be able to not just say, I need to know how to, fix a car. I need to know how to take care of a horse, etc. It's to say, I need to know how to be ignorant. I need to know that I don't know, and that I will continuously not know. And that not knowing is not bad. It doesn't mean that I'm incompetent. It doesn't mean that I'm not prescient, because you cannot be competent or prescient in that way. And just to go back to your very first point is that humans are a small part of this universe. We're not running the show. The planet Earth is not like a car where, if only I had better headlights and better steering, I'd be able to go exactly where I want to go. You can't go where you want to go anyhow. The car is stuck to the surface. Well, what if you were a bird? Okay, now I need to be a bird. But this is a way of thinking that's going to make you continuously inadequate. The way to be adequate is to recognize and have humility. We do not create the future. This is a complex, emergent universe. Most of the experiments, meaning most of the things that happen, boom, 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 have nothing to do with conscious human intention. we wake just think about it even in very general terms. When you wake up in the morning, what was Adam Smith talking about? Nobody tells you must go and make needles, pins, the way Adam Smith used in his example in The Wealth of Nations. Nobody says that. You say it to yourself because the logic of your position and the logic of your internal thinking leads you to do that, what Adam Smith called the invisible hand. But we don't plan the world around us. It happens in all sorts of crazy ways. And you might say, I wish I could stop that. I wish I could control it. But that's just not our universe. Our universe just is not that way.
True. Has it got a little bit to do with intuition?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Intuition. In other words, and it has to do with emotion, and it has to do with our senses. It has to do with all sorts of different elements that make up the richness of our perception? Why reduce humanity's relationship to the world around us? Why should I, as a person, say, look, I'm only thinking about the rational data-based elements here, and I'm only confining my reflections to the algorithm, which has proved its worth because big data has shown that I can test it on a big data source and the model is robust on the basis of this past algorithm. And the rest of it, don't bother me. The truth of the matter is that even if they put the menu in front of you and they say to you, 99% of all customers were satisfied with this dish at the restaurant. You might feel that day because you want to do something different, because you're in a good mood, or because you're a little bit crazy. You say, let me experiment with something wacky. Let me try something on the menu that only 1% tried. And guess what? You might discover something. It might inspire you to do something. In other words, humans have this unbelievable capacity to do crazy things and to be inspired, to be destructive. And this is a very powerful experimental source. In other words, and let me just take it back to something, there was a famous statement back in 2008, 2009, where the Queen of England said, why didn't the economists know in advance? and why didn't we understand that there was a pandemic coming and prepare everything for it? Well, you can't live in a universe without surprises. Surprises will happen in one way or the other. Of course, we can put exit signs over the door so that if there's a fire, we can escape. But those are relatively simple and straightforward propositions. When it comes to complex social phenomenon, war, poverty, health, we live in this world that's continuously inviting us to test and to do crazy things and to learn from that. So overshooting, undershooting, creating, I'll just give you another example, the dot-com boom. The dot-com boom was crazy, but most booms are crazy. Or let's take another current hype cycle, the AI hype cycle, the artificial intelligence hype cycle. You can say to yourself, if we were rational, we would eliminate all of those peaks, right? We have peaks of interest. All of a sudden, people are interested in cloning. That was Dolly the sheep. All of a sudden, people are interested in the blockchain. All of a sudden, people are interested in AI, et cetera, et cetera. And you'd say, let's eliminate all that irrational exuberance. That's a word from economics. But the point that I'm trying to make is that irrational exuberance generates experiments. And those experiments, even the failed ones and the successful ones, the ones that I would never have done this if I hadn't been building on top of the craziness of the dot-com boom. It got so high, I did some kooky things. I had money to do something that made no sense at all. But then, lo and behold, I learned something. I experimented. In other words, this is not an exercise in and to go back to the point of departure, creating this rational, reductive, deterministic, controlled, managed world. That's an impoverished world. It's a world without the beauty, the horror, the force of a creative universe. And I think we need to live, because I think it's better in so many ways from the point of view of how we feel, but also from the point of view of our ability to take advantage. Now, I don't know where that will take us. So I cannot tell you what kind of future I'm talking about. And that future may be very weird, very strange, completely different from anything I personally, I might not like that future. But I can't stop it or control it. I can contribute to it by putting my drop of my values, my actions into the flow of the universe. And of course, that still means that we have moral responsibility and that we still make our own choices, and we make those choices with our image of the future in our minds. But it means that we're in a much more modest perspective, much more open perspective.
Okay. Yes, the future is there, and like it is uncertain, and you cannot do anything about that. And I think that this is what makes it exciting, actually, the surprise factor in it. I would like to ask you if diversifying why and how humans imagine the future, would that change how we create and use knowledge?
Yeah, this is a you know, I mean, we currently live with an education system that I think reflects very well the needs. And this was not something determined in advance. It was something that emerged over time through experimentation and testing and functionality. It's an ecosystem outcome. We live with a system of schooling that, first of all, is very efficient for taking care of children while parents work. This is an important issue. You have to have a mechanism for keeping children safe while parents work. And it needs to be relatively efficient from the point of view of not being too costly. The other thing we have is that, at the end of 12 years, you need to be able to do something that is not all that easy for humans, which is you need to show up on time, you need to listen to the teacher or to the boss, and you need to be able to work with people you've never met before. So these things school is very efficient at doing, although I think 12 years is a long time. But at least at the end of 12 years, if you've proven that you can show up on time, perform to the test, and collaborate, or live in relative harmony with your classmates who you don't necessarily know, or who come from different backgrounds, well, then you can probably go to an office tower or to a factory, etc. And of course, reading and writing are very helpful from the point of view of being able to navigate a city or deal with a situation in the workplace. Very useful skills. But we know that from the point of view of actual skill acquisition, somewhere between 70 to 95% of what people use at work, they learned at work. They did not learn it in advance. Well, which is normal. Now, you might say that they're much better able to learn at work because they've been prepared. But a lot of the preparation is, in fact, wasted. Do you know the date when the coronation took place of X person? Well, what was the mathematical formula you learned for physics in 11th grade, et cetera? I mean, a lot of this is not really that relevant for the learning part of things. Behavior, probably pretty important. But so if we think about that side of things, there's really the issue of pull learning. Learning, you need to, something you want to know when you realize you don't know it. So I don't know how to fix this, faucet, or I don't know how to cook this cake. And you pull the knowledge to yourself. And I think that the balance between push and pull learning in current societies is rather, imbalanced. It's just we're very oriented towards push, what you need to know in advance, be prepared, versus pull, which is improvisational, specific to the context you're in, and is based on giving time to learn. That means to experiment. If the idea is when you go to a job, you know how to do everything in advance. If you're going to go cooking, you already know all the recipes, etc. Well, of course, then boom, 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 you do it right away and you're supposed to get it perfect. But if you're saying, I'm going to go into the kitchen and I'm going to have to think about this and I'm going to have to experiment a little bit. And maybe the first time I do it, it won't be so good. And the second time it won't be so good. And then the third time I'll decide I got to change direction entirely. Well, people will say, what are you, incompetent? Weren't you trained? And so there's this really significant issue that we have in shifting from a push world where we're supposed to be prescient. We know what you need to know, and we will prepare you for what you need to know in the future because we know what the future will be like. Okay, so you push the knowledge to them and you say, you need to learn this manual backwards and forwards so you can learn, so you can operate the equipment. Well, by the time you get to the job, the equipment's changed completely. It doesn't even use the same mechanisms, and you have to start again. Well, we have a certain tolerance for that. We say, well, too bad, but they should have given you the better manual because they should have known that we changed the equipment. No, 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 no. Turn it around and say, when you have the ability to know what you need to learn, in other words, to identify your ignorance, how do you begin to build that learning through experimentation, through networking, through calling and asking people, through creating learning communities that are very specific to the specific context. And this opens up, of course, a much more diversified world, because it's not just about preparing everybody to be like Silicon Valley, or everybody to be like, Singapore, or whatever happens to be the model. It really is about saying, as you begin to privilege more pull learning and understanding ignorance, you also begin to realize that what you feel and you perceive in the world around you as something you need to know might not be the same as somebody somewhere else. And that what gives meaning and what creates community and what creates social relationships is not always the same in every place. And by moving towards a more pull-oriented than a push-oriented, we move away from the standardization, the massification, the industrialization, the efficiency of homogeneity, towards a much more open, differentiated, diverse kind of world. And that world itself, which appreciates and recognizes and cultivates difference, change, specificity, is actually much more in tune with creativity. Because creativity and the confidence and inspiration behind creativity are connected to, I don't know something, I'm going to learn about it. And having the confidence to do that, and to do it in a way which fits your circumstances, fits your history, your culture, your language, and doesn't say, I need to be like everybody else. So to a certain extent, it's true, it's anti-conformist. But we pay a very, very high price for conformism. And it doesn't mean that I'm not happy that we're speaking English. And I understand how strict and how powerful the fact that we have a common language. And we often forget how homogenizing language can be. But I'm also very appreciative of the fact that we can do what we're doing now virtually, because that actually shifts the ability that we have to connect, to discuss, to share, away from the very expensive, very elitist face-to-face approach of the past. And so things are continuously evolving in that way and opening up challenges for us to find meaning, create meaning, and in that sense, nourish, fertilize the creativity of the world around us, which I think in the end is going to, it's a much more resilient strategy. Think about it this way. If you build a bridge, you can build it very, very strong. It's going to last for a long time. But then let's say there's an earthquake, the bridge falls down. Okay. But if you have 1,000 boats, you don't create the traffic jams on the bridge. You diversify. You put your eggs in more than one basket. This is a better resilience strategy than saying we're going to build the perfect management machine to manage the world as if it was a big machine. This, I think, it sets us up to be fragile, vulnerable, but also to not take advantage of the richness, meaning the creativity of the universe in which we live.
But what is really the role of policymakers, of governments, and also the private sectors? Like, what are some perhaps concrete examples and concrete actions they could implement to encourage futures literacy?
Very, very good and very important question. But the starting point from my point of view is that they're all ecosystems, meaning firms, the enterprise world is an ecosystem of birth and death, and it's structured along certain lines. And one of the fascinating things, of course, is that you actually want firms to die. Firms are trying to be immortal, but if they were immortal, they wouldn't be very dynamic. One of the great strengths of an enterprise system and of a market system is that people launch ideas, the ideas fail, and they launch new ideas. So the churn, the turnover, the birth and the death in the enterprise sector is actually a good thing. So oftentimes when people ask me, to talk about the future, and they say, well, look, how can I make sure that my firm is immortal, that it lives forever, and that we will survive every change and everything? Well, there is a worthy challenge to say, how can you adapt? How can you become better? How can you improve? How can you continue to survive? It's not like you want to commit suicide. But there is also this question of saying, maybe the time has passed. Maybe there's no longer a reason to tie up our assets in this place. And also the fact that a firm dies, failure is part of the experimentalist strength of the enterprise system, of the market system. And to therefore not stigmatize or see failure and death of a company as that big a problem. So that's on a kind of the future and the ecosystem of enterprises and companies and firms. So, I mean, a futures literacy perspective, I think, alters our view of how the future gets used in the enterprise corporate sector, and also the nature of the functioning, the way it operates, and to not be as preoccupied by too big to fail, and to understand that failure is actually a way to enhance. Now, this is not a new proposition. Economists like Joseph Schumpeter talked about creative destruction a long time ago, but it's often very hard for us to live with that, and we become kind of phobic and traumatized by that kind of change. And that's where often governments come in, and I'll move to the policymakers. The policymakers have a sense that they're much more in the game of continuity and durability and things that last forever. And so if you say, well, the government, the nation should be immortal, the state should be immortal, most people will think, yeah, it should be immortal. But on the other hand, I mean, you have to kind of take, again, a step back and say, look, there have not always been nation states. And there have not always been, governments and legal systems that establish the rules of the game in this way. Now, I don't have a particular answer to that. But one of the things that we see in the world around us today is that whether you're in the private sector or the public sector, policy is essentially a way of talking about maintaining power for bureaucracies. So bureaucracies want to be successful. Bureaucracies want to control the world. That's what they're supposed to do. And they want to do it through command and control, planning, knowing in advance, results-based management, etc. And so you get into a situation today in the public and in the private sector where, we're basically creating a delusion, the delusion of control, the delusion of continuity, which leads to a lot of brittleness and leads to a lot of disappointment and leads to a lot of fear. Because people look at governments and they say, the government promised. They promised they would do this, they promised they would do that. And then the promises did not get fulfilled. And people get angry. But what I see in part as happening is that we're keeping people, in a sense, in a futures illiteracy. We're saying, don't worry about the future. The technocrats, the bureaucrats, the people who will make the world great again, those people will take care of the future. And so you can just sit back and enjoy the ride. No, it doesn't work that way. That's not the way our universe functions. And so we have a very deep and fundamental problem that in part is connected to futures illiteracy, the lack of futures literacy, which is essentially, we don't exercise our ability to play a role in the world around us. And again, I'm not saying controlling the world, but playing a role, and also being more modest and more humble about and also more aware of the interdependence. We are deeply interdependent. We are social creatures, but we are also natural creatures. We are animals, and we are part of a universe where animals have, exist like us. And so being aware of all of that, I think, alters the way in which we understand what allows us to live socially. And here I just want to hint at something, which is, let's imagine, this is just an exercise, a speculative kind of scenario. Let's imagine a world where there's a lot more playgrounds. Now, playgrounds are something we do in school. And in school, you physically experiment with running, with pushing, with playing, with meeting, with da-da-da. Now, let's create a lot more simulated environments. I have 100 avatars, and my avatars grow and change, and one is popular for me, and I learn by being somebody else, by having a different personality, by having a different gender, by living in a different place. And I use that simulation to understand what it means to be destructive, what it means to be antisocial, why it makes sense to obey certain rules, because those rules will make the world a more pleasant place, less, hostile for me, less suffering for others, etc. If we could imagine a future in which we are using virtual reality, simulation, much more extensively, and enabling play, so game playing, much more widely, potentially we could find ways to internalize many of the rules that today we think have to be imposed externally. Humans are savages. The only way that we will be, and I use this in quotes, civilized, is if somebody tells us you cannot do this. So put police on every corner, put penalties on every corner, and then people will obey and everything will be fine. That's external. What happens when you internalize this? When you begin to realize through wisdom, learning through experience, that there's a good reason, because we are social creatures, we are interdependent, our happiness, our sadness, our sense of well-being depends on each other, that we can learn how to live well. Wisdom, well changes over time, what it means to live well, and that can all be part of enjoying the creativity of this universe. So maybe a bit of an indirect answer, because I don't think that we design the future. I think what we can talk about is the potential for us to let go of bureaucracy, let go of policy, empower people, change the power relationships, and see what happens. And I'm, from that point of view, and this is just, I have no real evidence, I can't have any evidence, but I think that humans are actually pretty good at learning. And I think in that sense, I'd be optimistic that if we reduced bureaucracy and allowed for people to have more power and to exercise their imaginations and to situate their hopes and their fears in their own context and their own history, we could actually be more at peace, more in harmony with the universe that we live in. And this is an assemblage universe, not a hierarchical pyramid structure, macro, micro, etc., command and control hierarchy. It's a heterarchical universe where things like happiness are not hierarchical. Your happiness is not better or worse than my happiness. It cannot be compared. And so many of the fundamental things that give life meaning and richness are not hierarchical, they're heterarchical, and they're open, and they evolve. And so taking a wisdom approach, in part nourished by futures literacy, opens up for me a potentially completely different way of governing, because it changes the power relationships. But of course, that's just a fantasy.
Great. We are running out of time. We still have less than 6 minutes to conclude. I will end with 3 fire questions, which are this or that questions. They are only 3. You can also answer both. Okay, so the first one is reality or imagination?
I'd say reality is a function of imagination. very strongly, our perception of reality, what's poisonous, what's dangerous, is very deeply influenced by our images of the future. Not completely, but very strongly. So they're connected.
Okay. The second one, top-down or bottom-up approaches for future literacies?
I would say variable geometry, meaning you have all sorts of changes. The thing that seems to me to be important here is to allow, in this sense, reality or the present to play the role of determining. Is it bottom up or top down? You don't know in advance. You need to figure it out as it happens. Now, that might mean that you have to prepare some top down, put the exit signs on the building so that people can get out in a fire. But it also means a lot of spontaneity. So that's probably a both.
Okay. So the last question, traveling back in time or traveling into the future?
Which would I like to? Well, look, it sometimes disturbs people to think this, but I think our image of the future, which is in the present, right? The future doesn't exist. The future only exists as anticipation, meaning what we imagine from the point of view of conscious human anticipation in the present. When we change our image of the future, I'm not going to the office because there's a pandemic on. When we change our image of the future, we also change our image of the past. Oh, wow. So maybe the blockchain could help with this transition. I didn't think of that. Or maybe Zoom, I had never really looked at Zoom, and so it actually changes our perception of the past. We see the past in new ways, depending on the way in which we imagine the future. So the past, present, and future are deeply interconnected.
Okay, and one bonus question. Do you think that the future will be good or bad?
What did I have for breakfast? What's my mood today? It depends a lot, and this might seem shocking because I'll take it at a very, very high level. But our species, might disappear. But I think it's better to live thinking that we might disappear and doing things in ways which could potentially provoke that disappearance than living safely as if we wanted to live forever. So I think that we will be able, from my point of view, this is the optimistic view, we will be able to mature and become wiser. We're a very young species. And I think as we become wiser, we will become less preoccupied or frightened of mortality and immortality, and understand that we're part of a very amazing universe where birth, death, entry and exit, being part of, being outside are just the way things are, and that we will find meaning and enjoyment in living that in the present.
That's a great end to our conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Professor Miller. Any final notes?
No, thank you very much. Appreciate the chance to talk to you, and very glad to be part of the process here.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, our dear audience. Thank you for the interpreters, of course, again and again. Thank you so much, Professor Miller. And we see you again at 3 p.m. Dubai time with the third session of the final day of the Virtual Knowledge Summit in a session about the role of knowledge in the energy transition. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.